They say grief changes you, but nobody warns you that it might also reveal the people around you in ways you never imagined. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I'm 28 years old. 6 months ago, I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood loyalty, respect, and what it meant to honor someone's memory. I was wrong about all of it. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about stolen money or broken trust. It's about discovering that sometimes the people closest to us can become strangers overnight, and how finding the courage to do what's right can cost you everything and give you everything back. This is the story of how I learned that protecting my husband's legacy would mean going to war with his own mother.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of our small apartment in Cedar Falls, Iowa, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that Marcus had refinished himself just 2 years earlier. I sat at the kitchen table, running my fingers along the smooth surface he'd been so proud of, remembering how he'd spent countless weekends sanding and staining each plank to perfection. "Every detail matters, Eve," he'd say, his brown eyes lighting up with that focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about. "If you're going to do something, do it right the first time." Marcus Anthony Carter had been my husband for 3 beautiful, too short years. At 31, he'd already served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the Army's 10th Mountain Division, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for his service. But to me, he was simply the man who made terrible dad jokes at inappropriate moments, who could fix anything with his hands, and who had this incredible ability to make everyone around him feel like they mattered. Our life together had been simple but rich. Marcus worked as a paramedic for the Cedar Falls Emergency Medical Services while pursuing his nursing degree at night. I taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, where my students adored the days when Mr. Marcus would visit to talk about first aid or help with our classroom garden. We lived paycheck to paycheck, but we were building something together. A foundation for the family we dreamed of having, the house we'd someday buy, the life we'd create far from the chaos of his deployments. The apartment reflected our shared dreams and Marcus's practical nature. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen or lovingly restored. The couch came from a garage sale and had been reupholstered by Marcus's steady hands. The coffee table was built from reclaimed barnwood he'd found at a demolition site. Even our wedding photos were displayed in frames he'd crafted himself from leftover oak. Marcus believed that home wasn't about having the most expensive things. It was about surrounding yourself with items that told your story. In those days, our biggest worries were mundane and manageable. Would we have enough saved for a down payment by the time Marcus graduated? Should we start trying for children now, or wait until he finished school? These conversations happened over morning coffee, during evening walks around the neighborhood, or late at night when we lie in bed planning our future with the confidence of 2 people who believed they had all the time in the world. Marcus's relationship with his mother, Dorothy Carter, had always been complicated, though I hadn't fully understood the depth of those complications until much later. Dorothy was 63, a widow who had raised Marcus and his younger sister, Jessica, largely on her own after their father died in a construction accident when Marcus was 12. She lived in a modest duplex about 20 minutes away in Waterloo, in the same neighborhood where Marcus had grown up. From the outside, Dorothy appeared to be a devoted mother who had sacrificed for her children. She worked for 35 years as a receptionist at a dental office, never remarrying, always putting Marcus and Jessica first. When Marcus enlisted, she'd been simultaneously proud and terrified, sending care packages overseas and attending every homecoming ceremony. She kept photo albums filled with newspaper clippings about his unit and had his military awards displayed prominently in her living room. But there were subtle tensions that I noticed during family gatherings. Dorothy had strong opinions about how Marcus should live his life, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. She thought he was wasting his time in the GI Bill benefits on nursing school when he could have used his military experience to get a better-paying job immediately. She questioned whether we were being responsible by renting instead of buying, even though we'd explained multiple times that we were saving for a proper down payment. Most significantly, she seemed to view me as competition for Marcus's attention and loyalty. Marcus has always been too generous for his own good, she'd say with a tight smile whenever we'd decline her suggestions about how we should spend our money or time. He needs someone who'll look out for his best interests. The implication was always clear. She didn't think I was that someone.
Despite these undercurrents, Marcus maintained a respectful relationship with his mother. He called her twice a week, helped with yard work and home repairs, and made sure she was included in our holiday celebrations. Family is family, he'd tell me when I had expressed frustration about her comments. She raised me and Jess on her own after Dad died. She's earned the right to have opinions, even when I don't agree with them.
Jessica, now 26, lived in Minneapolis, where she worked as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization. She visited Cedar Falls infrequently, usually only for major holidays or family emergencies. When she did visit, she and Marcus would fall back into easy sibling rhythms, sharing inside jokes, reminiscing about childhood adventures, and good-naturedly arguing about everything from politics to which pizza place in town had the best crust. Jessica had always been supportive of our marriage, and I genuinely enjoyed her company during her brief visits. The three of us, Marcus, Dorothy, and Jessica, represented Marcus's entire family. His father's relatives lived in distant states and had little contact after the funeral years earlier. Dorothy's family was small and scattered, with only an elderly aunt in Florida maintaining occasional phone contact. This small, tight family unit meant that every relationship carried extra weight, every disagreement had heightened significance, and every tradition or expectation held particular importance. In the weeks before the accident, Marcus had been especially excited about several developments in our life. His grades in nursing school were excellent, and his professors had mentioned potential opportunities for him to specialize in emergency nursing, which would combine his military medical experience with his passion for helping people in crisis situations. We'd also started seriously house hunting, spending Saturday mornings driving through neighborhoods and imagining ourselves in different homes. Marcus had a notebook where he'd sketch layout ideas and calculate renovation costs, always thinking 3 steps ahead about how to make any house truly ours. Our financial situation, while modest, was stable and improving. Marcus received monthly VA disability payments for injuries sustained during his second deployment, primarily hearing loss and chronic pain in his left shoulder from a roadside bomb incident. These payments, combined with his GI Bill education benefits, helped supplement our income while he was in school. We'd opened a joint savings account specifically for our house fund and had been steadily contributing to it for over a year. Marcus was meticulous about our finances, keeping detailed records of every expense and regularly reviewing our progress toward our goals. He'd inherited his father's practical approach to money: spend carefully, save consistently, and always have a plan for unexpected expenses. This careful management meant that, despite our modest incomes, we were actually in better financial shape than many of our friends who earned more but spent without the same level of intentionality. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Marcus left for his shift at the ambulance service at 6 a.m., kissing me goodbye and reminding me that he had class that evening but would be home by 9. I had parent-teacher conferences scheduled until 7, so we'd planned to meet for a late dinner at Romano's, the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first official date 4 years earlier. These small rituals and plans were the threads that wove our daily life together, creating a pattern of normalcy and connection that I now realize I took completely for granted. By noon that day, our carefully constructed world would be shattered, and I would begin a journey that would reveal truths about family, loyalty, and justice that I never could have imagined. But in those final morning hours of our life together, as I prepared my lesson plans and Marcus responded to emergency calls around Cedar Falls, we were simply a young couple building a future, surrounded by the people we trusted most, believing that love and hard work were enough to protect the life we were creating together.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The call came at 12:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started with unseasonably warm weather for March in Iowa. I was in the middle of explaining fractions to my third graders when Mrs. Henderson, our school secretary, appeared in my classroom doorway with an expression that immediately told me something was terribly wrong. Her usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a careful, practiced neutrality that administrators use when delivering devastating news. "Evelyn, could you step into the hallway for a moment?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying that particular tone that makes your stomach drop before your brain has even processed why. I left my students with their math worksheets and followed Mrs. Henderson into the corridor, where Principal Martinez was waiting with a man I'd never seen before. Tall, probably in his 50s, wearing a paramedic uniform from a different service district than Marcus's. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed suddenly too bright, casting harsh shadows that made everyone's faces look gaunt and unfamiliar. "Mrs. Carter," Principal Martinez began, his voice gentle but direct. "This is Chief Paramedic William Thompson from Black Hawk County EMS. He needs to speak with you about your husband." The next few minutes exist in my memory like fragments of a broken mirror. Sharp pieces that reflect distorted images of the moment my life split into a before and after. Chief Thompson explained that Marcus had been responding to a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 218 when a drunk driver ran a red light and struck their ambulance at full speed. His partner, Sarah Mitchell, was in critical condition at Unity Point Health. Marcus had been pronounced dead at the scene. The drunk driver was a 22-year-old college student named Brandon Walsh, who had been drinking since 10 in the morning at a fraternity party. He walked away from the crash with minor bruises and a blood alcohol content of 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Marcus, who had survived 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, had been killed by a drunk college kid on a Tuesday afternoon while trying to save someone else's life. I don't remember much about the rest of that day. Principal Martinez drove me to the hospital where I was supposed to identify Marcus's body, but I couldn't bring myself to go into the room. Instead, I sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, staring at my hands and trying to understand how someone could be making plans for dinner 8 hours earlier and be gone by lunch. Jessica drove down from Minneapolis as soon as she got the call, arriving around 6 p.m. with red-rimmed eyes and a fierce determination to handle all the practical details that grief makes impossible to manage. Dorothy's reaction to her son's death revealed aspects of her personality that I had only glimpsed during our 3 years of family gatherings. While Jessica and I clung to each other in shared devastation, Dorothy immediately shifted into a mode of protective control that felt both overwhelming and oddly detached from the actual loss we were experiencing. Within hours of Marcus's death, she had appointed herself the primary decision-maker for all funeral arrangements, contacted the VA to inquire about burial benefits, and begun making lists of people who needed to be notified. Marcus would want this done right, she kept saying, as if efficiency and proper protocol could somehow honor his memory better than the messy, raw grief that Jessica and I were experiencing. When I suggested that we hold the memorial service at the community center where Marcus and I had been married, Dorothy dismissed the idea immediately. "The funeral home chapel is more appropriate," she declared. "Marcus deserves dignity." The funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning at Brennan Mathena Funeral Home, with military honors provided by the Iowa National Guard. The chapel was packed with people whose lives Marcus had touched. Paramedic colleagues, classmates from nursing school, neighbors, teachers and parents from my school, and dozens of people I didn't recognize who had apparently been helped by Marcus at some point during his years of service. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and service, and Marcus's former Army unit presented me with a folded flag while 3 uniformed soldiers fired a 21-gun salute in the parking lot. I remember very little of the actual service, but I'll never forget the reception afterward. Dorothy had arranged it to be held in the funeral home's basement gathering room, and she spent most of the time accepting condolences and talking about Marcus's military service with an almost performative pride that felt disconnected from the son I had known and loved. She displayed photo boards showing Marcus in uniform, referenced his medals and commendations, and repeatedly mentioned his VA benefits and military pension as if these somehow quantified the value of his life. He served his country with honor, she told anyone who would listen, and thank God the government takes care of our fallen heroes' families. At the time, I thought her focus on the practical aspects of military benefits was simply her way of coping with grief by concentrating on concrete details rather than emotional realities. Jessica, meanwhile, had thrown herself into the role of protective sister, fielding phone calls, coordinating with the funeral director, and making sure I ate something occasionally. She had taken a leave of absence from her job in Minneapolis and was staying with me in the apartment that Marcus and I had shared. Every evening, we'd sit in our living room, surrounded by casserole dishes from well-meaning neighbors, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that no longer contained Marcus.
The insurance situation was more complicated than I had anticipated. Marcus's life insurance policy through his work was relatively small, $50,000, and the VA survivor benefits would take several weeks to process. The drunk driver's insurance company was already sending representatives to discuss settlements, but their initial offer was insultingly low and came with legal language that seemed designed to minimize their responsibility. Jessica helped me find a lawyer, David Kim from a firm in Cedar Rapids, who specialized in wrongful death cases involving impaired drivers. During one of our first meetings, Mr. Kim explained that the civil case against Brandon Walsh and his insurance company could take years to resolve, especially if they chose to fight the claim. These companies will use every delay tactic in the book, he warned. They're hoping you'll get desperate and accept whatever they offer. Don't let them wear you down. The legal process felt like another layer of violation. Not only had Marcus been taken from me, but now I had to fight for the financial recognition that his life had value. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Brandon Walsh was proceeding through the district attorney's office. Walsh had been charged with vehicular homicide while intoxicated, but his family had hired an expensive defense attorney who was already filing motions to suppress evidence and challenge the blood alcohol test results. The prosecutor, a woman named Amanda Rodriguez, assured me that they had a strong case, but she also prepared me for the possibility that Walsh might receive a plea agreement that would reduce his charges and sentence. Justice doesn't always look the way we want it to, she told me during one particularly difficult meeting, but I promise you that we'll fight for the strongest possible outcome. These conversations about legal strategies and potential sentences felt surreal. How do you quantify the value of someone's life in terms of years served or dollars awarded? The most challenging aspect of those first weeks was learning to navigate daily life as a widow at 28. Married friends didn't know how to act around me, as if grief might be contagious. Single friends tried to be supportive, but couldn't relate to the specific pain of losing a spouse. Colleagues at school were kind but awkward, offering help with lesson plans and covering my duties, while clearly having no idea what I actually needed. The apartment felt simultaneously too empty and too full, empty of Marcus's presence, but full of his belongings, his projects, his plans that would never be completed. His nursing textbooks were still stacked on the kitchen table where he'd left them before his final shift. His coffee mug sat in the dishwasher, unwashed since that Tuesday morning. The house fund notebook remained open to the page where he'd been calculating mortgage payments for a 3-bedroom bungalow we'd looked at the previous weekend. Dorothy visited frequently during those early weeks, always bringing food and always staying too long. She had opinions about everything, which of Marcus's belongings I should keep, how I should handle the insurance claims, whether I should consider moving back to my hometown in Missouri to be closer to my own family. "You're so young," she'd say with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Marcus wouldn't want you to be tied down by all this responsibility." Her comments about my age and future always felt loaded with implications that I wasn't equipped to handle Marcus's legacy properly. When I mentioned that I was considering keeping the apartment because it held so many memories of our life together, she shook her head dismissively. Memories don't pay rent, Evelyn. You need to be practical about your situation now. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received the first official communication from the Department of Veterans Affairs regarding Marcus's survivor benefits. The letter, printed on official letterhead and filled with bureaucratic language, explained that I was entitled to monthly dependency and indemnity compensation payments, educational assistance, home loan benefits, and various other survivor programs. The monthly payment amount was substantial enough to make a significant difference in my financial stability, though it felt wrong to think of Marcus's death in economic terms. The VA representative I spoke with, a kind woman named Catherine Mills, explained that the benefits process could take several months to finalize, but that retroactive payments would ensure I received everything I was entitled to from the date of Marcus's death. She also mentioned that if Marcus and I had had children, there would be additional educational benefits available to them until they reached 18. These benefits exist because your husband earned them through his service. There's no shame in using every resource available to you. That's exactly what these programs were designed for. Her words provided some comfort, but they also highlighted how completely my life had changed. I was now defined by loss rather than partnership, by surviving rather than building a future together. As March turned into April, I slowly began to accept that this new reality wasn't temporary. Marcus wasn't coming back from a deployment this time. The life we had planned together existed only in memory now. The future I had imagined, the house, the children, the decades of growing old together, had been replaced by uncertainty, legal battles, and the overwhelming task of rebuilding an identity that had been shaped by partnership and shared dreams. I had no idea that the most devastating challenges still lay ahead, or that the family I was leaning on for support would soon become the source of the greatest betrayal I could have imagined.
2 months after Marcus's funeral, I was finally beginning to establish some semblance of routine in my drastically altered life. The raw, paralyzing grief that had consumed those first weeks was slowly transforming into something more manageable, a persistent ache that colored everything, but no longer prevented me from functioning. I have returned to teaching, though my students seemed to handle my occasional emotional moments with more grace than most adults. Children have an intuitive understanding of sadness that doesn't require explanations or apologies. Jessica had reluctantly returned to Minneapolis after staying with me for nearly a month, but we talked every evening and she visited most weekends. Her presence had been a lifeline during those darkest weeks, and I dreaded the loneliness that settled over the apartment after her Sunday departures. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow, as if the walls themselves were mourning Marcus's absence. My VA survivor benefits had finally been processed, and the monthly payments were more substantial than I had anticipated. Catherine Mills had been incredibly thorough in explaining every program I qualified for, including educational benefits that would allow me to pursue graduate school if I chose to. "Your husband's service opened doors for both of you," she explained during one of our phone conversations. "These benefits represent his investment in your future together." The money felt both like a blessing and a burden. It provided financial security I desperately needed, but it also served as a monthly reminder of the price that had been paid for it. Each direct deposit into my account represented Marcus's sacrifice, and I found myself being almost obsessively careful about how I spent it. Every purchase became a moral calculation. Would Marcus approve of this expense? Was I honoring his memory or taking advantage of his death? During this period, Dorothy's visits became more frequent and somehow more intrusive. She had developed a pattern of arriving unannounced, usually during times when she'd know I'd be home from school, but before I'd had a chance to decompress from the day. She would let herself in using the spare key Marcus had given her for emergencies, and I'd often find her in the kitchen, cleaning or organizing things that didn't need attention. "I was just making sure you're eating properly," she'd say when I'd express mild irritation about finding her rearranging my cabinets. "Marcus would want someone looking after you." These intrusions always came with subtle criticisms wrapped in maternal concern. My housekeeping wasn't up to her standards, my meal planning was inadequate, and my financial decisions showed a lack of practical wisdom that worried her. What began to trouble me most was Dorothy's increasing focus on my VA benefits and how I was managing them. She asked detailed questions about the monthly amounts, wanted to know about the educational benefits, and seemed particularly interested in understanding the various programs available to military survivors. Initially, I assumed this interest came from a place of wanting to ensure I was maximizing every resource available to me. "You're entitled to so much more than you realize," she told me during one of our phone conversations. "The government owes you and Marcus for his service. You shouldn't be shy about claiming everything you deserve." She had researched various VA programs online and printed out information about benefits I hadn't even known existed. Vocational rehabilitation, adaptive housing grants, and special monthly compensation for specific service-related conditions. Her knowledge impressed me at first. Here was someone who cared enough about my welfare to research options that could improve my situation. But as weeks passed, her questions became more specific and somehow more uncomfortable. She wanted to know exact payment dates, whether the money went into a joint account that still had Marcus's name on it, and how the VA verified my continued eligibility for spouse's benefits. "I'm just trying to understand how these systems work," she explained when I asked why she needed such detailed information. "If something happened to you, or if there were ever any problems with the payments, someone in the family should know how everything is set up." Her reasoning seemed logical, but something about her tone made me uneasy in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Brandon Walsh was progressing slowly through the court system. Prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez kept me informed of each development, though most involved legal motions and procedural delays that seemed designed to exhaust everyone's patience. Walsh's defense attorney was challenging everything from the blood alcohol test to the accident reconstruction, apparently hoping to find some technical error that might reduce the charges. "This is normal, unfortunately," Amanda explained during one of our monthly update meetings. "Defense attorneys in drunk driving cases know that time is on their side. Witnesses' memories fade, evidence gets harder to track, and prosecutors face pressure to move cases through the system. But we're not backing down on this one." The civil lawsuit was even more complex and frustrating. David Kim, my wrongful death attorney, had filed suit against both Brandon Walsh and the bar that had continued serving him despite obvious intoxication. The discovery process involved reviewing months of credit card receipts, security camera footage, and witness statements from the fraternity party where Brandon Walsh had been drinking all morning.
Civil cases like this can take 2 to 3 years to resolve, David warned me during one particularly discouraging meeting. "The insurance companies will drag out every phase of the process, hoping you'll get tired of fighting and accept a settlement that's far below what you deserve." The idea of spending years reliving Marcus's death through legal proceedings felt overwhelming, but David assured me that the case was strong and that persistence would eventually pay off. During this same period, I began noticing subtle changes in Dorothy's lifestyle that seemed inconsistent with her fixed income as a retired dental receptionist. She had always been careful with money, shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons with the dedication of someone who understood the value of every dollar. But suddenly, she was driving a newer car, not new, but significantly newer than the 15-year-old Honda she'd been driving since Marcus was in high school. When I complimented her on the upgraded vehicle, a silver 2019 Toyota Camry, she explained that she'd gotten a good deal from a dealer who was clearing out older inventory. "At my age, I need something reliable," she said. "I can't afford to be stranded on the side of the road." Her explanation was reasonable, but I wondered how she'd manage the down payment on a comfortable retirement budget. There were other small changes, too. Dorothy had always been practical in her clothing choices, shopping primarily at department store sales, and wearing the same wardrobe for years until items literally wore out. But during her visits that spring, I noticed she was wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Not expensive designer pieces, but clearly new purchases from better stores than her usual discount retailers. She had also mentioned, almost casually, that she was thinking about taking a vacation for the first time since Marcus's father died.
I've been looking at some cruise packages, she told me one afternoon while we sorted through Marcus's books. Nothing too fancy, just a short Caribbean trip. At my age, I need to start living a little instead of just surviving. The idea of Dorothy taking a cruise seemed so out of character that I initially thought she was joking. She had always talked about travel as an unnecessary luxury, something other people did while she focused on practical matters like saving for emergencies and planning for her eventual need for assisted living care. But she showed me brochures from various cruise lines and seemed genuinely excited about the possibility of spending a week away from Iowa's cold weather. "Life is short," she said. And the irony of using that phrase while sitting in the apartment where her dead son had lived wasn't lost on either of us. Marcus's death reminded me that we don't get unlimited time to do the things we dream about. Her newfound philosophy about seizing life's opportunities would have been touching if it hadn't felt so dramatically different from every conversation we'd had about money and priorities over the past 3 years. Around the same time, I began receiving monthly statements from the VA that itemized my survivor benefits with more detail than the previous general notifications. The statements showed not only my monthly DIC payments, but also any educational benefit usage, home loan entitlements, and other programs that might affect the total benefit calculation. As I reviewed these documents, trying to better understand my financial situation, I noticed something that confused me. The statements indicated that educational benefits under Marcus's GI Bill were being used, but I hadn't enrolled in any classes or programs. When I called Catherine Mills at the VA to ask about the discrepancy, she initially assumed it was a clerical error and promised to research the issue. But when she called back a few days later, her tone had changed significantly. "Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you some questions about benefit usage," she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Our records show that educational benefits have been transferred and are actively being used, but the usage isn't showing up under your Social Security number. Can you think of any reason why there might be confusion about who's accessing these benefits?" A cold feeling settled in my stomach as I tried to process what she was telling me. "I haven't used any educational benefits. I haven't even applied for them yet. Who does your system show as using them?" There was a long pause before Catherine responded, and when she did, her voice carried a professional caution that immediately made me nervous. "I can't discuss specific details over the phone, but I think we need to schedule an in-person meeting to review your entire benefit file. There appear to be some irregularities that require investigation. Can you come to our regional office in Des Moines sometime next week?" As I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking slightly. The word irregularities echoed in my mind, carrying implications that I didn't want to consider. Marcus had been meticulous about paperwork and official procedures. There was no way he would have made mistakes that would create problems with his VA benefits, which meant that any irregularities had occurred after his death, during the processing of survivor benefits. For the first time since Marcus's funeral, I felt a fear that had nothing to do with grief or loneliness. This was the sharp, focused fear that comes from realizing that someone you trust might have betrayed you in ways you haven't yet fully understood. As I looked around the apartment that Dorothy had been rearranging and reorganizing for months, I began to wonder what else I hadn't noticed. What other changes in her behavior I had attributed to grief or concern when they might have represented something far more calculating and deliberate. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together fragments of conversations and observations that suddenly seemed to form a pattern I desperately didn't want to see.
The VA regional office in Des Moines occupied a sprawling complex of beige buildings that seemed designed to intimidate anyone seeking help from the federal government. I arrived 20 minutes early for my appointment with Catherine Mills, sitting in my car in the parking lot while trying to calm the anxiety that had been building for 3 days since her phone call. The morning was humid and overcast, typical for Iowa in late May, and the heavy air seemed to match the weight of dread settling in my chest. Catherine met me in the lobby, and her expression immediately confirmed that my worst fears were justified. She was younger than I had expected from our phone conversations, probably early 30s, with short, dark hair, and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she dealt with difficult situations regularly. But there was something in her eyes, a mixture of sympathy and anger, that told me this wasn't going to be a simple administrative error that could be quickly resolved. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming in," she said, leading me through a maze of cubicles to a small conference room. "I want you to know that what we're going to discuss today is serious, and I want to make sure you understand all your options before we proceed." She had a thick file folder with her, and as she opened it on the table between us, I could see it was filled with official forms, computer printouts, and what appeared to be photocopied identification documents. "Before we begin," Catherine continued, "I need to ask you directly, have you given anyone else access to your personal information, social security number, military ID numbers, or any documentation related to Marcus's military service?" When I shook my head, she made a note on a legal pad and then looked at me with the kind of serious expression that precedes life-changing revelations. "Mrs. Carter, someone has been fraudulently accessing your husband's veteran benefits since approximately 2 weeks after his death. Educational benefits totaling over $8,000 have been used by someone claiming to be an eligible family member. Additionally, there have been 3 separate attempts to change the address for your survivor benefit payments, all of which were flagged by our fraud detection system." The words hit me like a physical blow. $8,000. Someone had stolen $8,000 from benefits that Marcus had earned through his military service, benefits that were meant to help me rebuild my life after losing him. But even as the financial impact sank in, what hurt more was the realization that this level of fraud required intimate knowledge of Marcus's military history and my personal information. Catherine spread several documents across the table, pointing to specific sections as she explained the scope of what had been discovered. The educational benefits were accessed using forged enrollment documents for a continuing education program at Hawkeye Community College. The forger used your social security number, but listed a different address, one that belongs to Dorothy Carter, who we understand is your mother-in-law. My hands began shaking as I stared at copies of enrollment forms that bore my name and social security number in handwriting that was definitely not mine. The signature was a crude attempt to mimic my own, but it was clearly written by someone else. The listed address was Dorothy's duplex in Waterloo, and the contact phone number was her landline. "There's more," Catherine continued, her expression combining professional duty with personal compassion. She read several documents across the table, pointing to specific sections as she explained the scope of what had been discovered. The educational benefits were accessed using forged enrollment documents for a continuing education program at Hawkeye Community College. The forger used your social security number, but listed a different address, one that belongs to Dorothy Carter, who we understand is your mother-in-law. My hands began shaking as I stared at copies of enrollment forms that bore my name and social security number in handwriting that was definitely not mine. My hands began shaking as I stared at copies of enrollment forms that bore my name and social security number in handwriting that was definitely not mine. The signature was a crude attempt to mimic my own, but it was clearly written by someone else. The listed address was Dorothy's duplex in Waterloo, and the contact phone number was her landline. "There's more," Catherine continued, her voice gentle but firm. "We've traced the educational benefits payments to a bank account that was opened 3 weeks after your husband's death. The account is in your name, but the signature cards and identification used to open it appear to be fraudulent. The account has been used primarily for cash withdrawals and travel-related expenses." She showed me bank statements that made my stomach turn. Regular withdrawals of $500 to $1,000, payments to travel agencies, charges for luggage and travel accessories, and a particularly large payment to something called Caribbean Cruise Lines. The pattern was clear. Someone had been systematically stealing Marcus's benefits and using them to fund a lifestyle I was supposedly living but had never experienced. "Mrs. Carter, I have to ask, is there any possibility that Mrs. Dorothy Carter could have had access to your personal documents or identification?" Catherine's question hung in the air like a challenge I didn't want to face. The implications were devastating, but the evidence was undeniable. Dorothy had been in my apartment countless times since Marcus's death, often alone while I was at work. She had helped Jessica and I go through Marcus's papers after the funeral. She had access to everything she would need to commit this kind of fraud. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what I was facing, but it was all I could manage. Catherine leaned forward, her expression combining professional duty with personal compassion. She said, "You have several options, and none of them are easy. We can handle this internally through VA fraud investigation, which would involve recovering the stolen benefits and preventing future access, but wouldn't necessarily result in criminal charges. Or you can file a police report and pursue this as identity theft and fraud, which could lead to criminal prosecution, but would also mean a longer, more public process." She paused, allowing me to absorb the weight of these choices. "There's also a third option. You could confront Mrs. Carter directly and see if she's willing to repay the stolen benefits voluntarily. Sometimes family situations like this can be resolved without involving law enforcement, though I have to warn you that voluntary repayment rarely covers the full amount stolen." As Catherine explained each option, I felt the last remnants of my old life crumbling away. The family support system I had relied on since Marcus's death was not only unreliable, it was actively predatory. Dorothy hadn't been helping me navigate grief and loss. She had been studying my vulnerabilities and exploiting them for financial gain. Every visit, every expression of concern, every piece of advice about managing my benefits had been a reconnaissance for a systematic theft operation.
"I need to see all the evidence," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I want copies of everything, the forged documents, the bank statements, the enrollment forms. If I'm going to accuse my mother-in-law of stealing from me, I want to be absolutely certain before I do it." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. I'm going to have our fraud investigation unit prepare a complete evidence package for you. But, Mrs. Carter, I need you to understand that this level of identity theft doesn't happen by accident. Whoever did this had to plan carefully, forge documents convincingly, and maintain the fraud over several months. This wasn't a desperate person making a single bad decision. This was calculated, deliberate theft." The drive home from Des Moines felt like the longest hour of my life. I kept replaying conversations with Dorothy over the past 3 months, looking for signs I had missed or explanations I had accepted too easily. Her sudden interest in my benefits, her detailed questions about payment schedules, her research into VA programs I hadn't known existed. It all made horrible sense now. She hadn't been trying to help me maximize my benefits. She had been learning how to steal them. By the time I reached Cedar Falls, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to confront Dorothy immediately. Instead, I was going to gather more evidence, document everything I could remember about her behavior since Marcus's death, and build the strongest possible case before taking any action. If I was going to destroy my relationship with Marcus's mother, and by extension, potentially my relationship with Jessica, I was going to make sure I had irrefutable proof of what Dorothy had done. That evening, I called Jessica and asked if she could drive down for the weekend. I didn't explain why over the phone, but something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency because she immediately agreed to leave Minneapolis first thing Saturday morning. I needed someone I could trust completely, someone who had known Dorothy longer than I had, and someone who would help me figure out how to handle the most devastating betrayal I could have imagined. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Dorothy called twice, ostensibly to check on me, but her questions seemed more pointed now that I knew what to listen for. She asked about my mail, whether I'd received any unusual correspondence from the VA, and whether I was happy with how my benefits were being processed. Each conversation felt like a chess match where only she knew the rules we were playing by. I started paying attention to details I had previously overlooked. During her Thursday visit, I noticed that she went through my mail while I was making coffee, sorting through envelopes with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time this had happened. When I returned to the kitchen, she had organized everything into neat piles and was holding a VA envelope that hadn't been opened yet. "Just making sure you don't miss anything important," she said, handing me the letter with a smile that now seemed calculating rather than caring. These government agencies send so much paperwork, it's easy to lose track of what's actually important. I managed to thank her while internally noting that she had been far too interested in correspondence that should have been none of her business. Friday night, I sat in Marcus's recliner with the evidence package Catherine had prepared, spreading the documents across our coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture I desperately didn't want to see. The forged signatures, the fake enrollment forms, the bank statements showing systematic theft, it was all there in black and white. Dorothy Carter, the woman who had raised the man I loved, who had grieved with me at his funeral, who had held my hand during those darkest early weeks, had been robbing me while pretending to comfort me. The most painful part was realizing that her theft wasn't just about money. She had stolen my ability to trust my own judgment, to feel secure in my relationships, to believe that the people closest to me had my best interest at heart. She had turned my grief into a weapon against me, using my vulnerability and isolation to cover her crimes. As I prepared for Jessica's arrival the next morning, I knew that the conversation we were about to have would change everything. There would be no going back to the careful family dynamics we had maintained since Marcus's death. I was about to ask Jessica to choose between believing me or defending her mother, and I had no idea which way that choice would go. But as I looked at the evidence spread before me, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with justice. Marcus had died serving others, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The least I could do was protect his memory and his benefits from someone who would exploit his death for her own gain. Tomorrow, I would cross a line that would define the rest of my life. I would stop being a victim and start being a fighter.
Jessica arrived at my apartment Saturday morning with the kind of focused energy that appeared whenever she sensed a crisis. She walked through my door carrying 2 large coffees and a bag of pastries from the bakery near her hotel, already scanning my face for clues about what had prompted my urgent call. I had spent most of Friday night rehearsing how to explain Dorothy's betrayal, but seeing Jessica's concerned expression made me realize that no amount of preparation could make this conversation easier. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, setting the coffee on my kitchen counter and pulling me into a fierce hug. "What's going on? You sounded scared on the phone, and you never sound scared." Her directness was both comforting and terrifying. Jessica had always been able to read me better than most people, which meant she would immediately know when I was holding back information. I led her to the living room where I had arranged the VA evidence package on the coffee table, organized by date and type of fraud. The documents looked even more damning in the morning light, spread across the surface like an indictment of everything I thought I knew about our family relationships. Jessica took one look at the papers and sank into the couch, her face already changing as she began to process what she was seeing. "Jess, I need you to look at these documents before I explain anything," I said, sitting beside her but giving her space to examine the evidence independently. "I want you to see what I'm seeing without me influencing your interpretation." It was crucial that Jessica reach her own conclusions about Dorothy's guilt. If I had to convince her to believe me, then I would always wonder whether her support was genuine or simply sisterly loyalty. She spent nearly 30 minutes going through every page, asking occasional questions about dates and amounts, but mostly reading in silence with an expression that grew darker with each revelation. When she reached the forged bank signature cards, she actually gasped, holding the documents closer to examine the handwriting with the kind of detailed attention that suggested she recognized something familiar about it. "This is Mom's handwriting," she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen her forge Dad's signature on insurance forms after he died. She had to practice for weeks to get it right, but she eventually became really good at copying other people's signatures." Jessica's admission hit me like a physical blow. Not only was Dorothy capable of this level of deception, but she had a history of document fraud that predated Marcus's death. "You knew she could forge signatures?" I asked, trying to keep the accusation out of my voice. Jessica looked up from the papers with tears in her eyes, clearly struggling with the implications of what she had just revealed. "I was 16 when Dad died," she said defensively. "Mom said it was easier than going through probate court for every little insurance claim. I thought all widows had to do things like that to access their dead husband's accounts."
Her explanation revealed how Dorothy had normalized fraud within their family, teaching her children that deception was an acceptable response to bureaucratic obstacles. As Jessica continued examining the evidence, I told her about my meeting with Catherine Mills, Dorothy's increasingly suspicious behavior, and my growing realization that the woman who had been supporting me through grief had actually been systematically robbing me. With each detail I shared, Jessica's expression shifted from shock to anger to something that looked like recognition. "She's been asking about your benefits too," Jessica admitted when I finished explaining everything. "During our phone calls, she always brings up how you're managing financially, whether the VA payments are reliable, if you're using all the programs you're entitled to. I thought she was just worried about your welfare, but now—" She trailed off, staring at the bank statements that showed months of fraudulent withdrawals. "What else has she asked you?" I pressed, realizing that Dorothy's information gathering had extended beyond just me. Jessica rubbed her temples, clearly trying to recall conversations that had seemed innocent at the time, but now carried sinister implications. "She wanted to know if you'd mentioned any problems with your benefits, if you were planning to move, whether you were dating anyone. She also asked weird questions about your job, like whether the school district had good insurance, if you were planning to stay in teaching, stuff that seemed like normal conversation but felt oddly specific." Jessica's recollections painted a picture of Dorothy conducting surveillance on multiple fronts, gathering intelligence that could help her maintain her fraud operation. We spent the rest of Saturday morning developing a plan. Jessica agreed to help me gather more evidence before confronting Dorothy directly, but she insisted that we also involve law enforcement from the beginning. If we tip her off that we know about the fraud, she might destroy evidence or try to cover her tracks. We need to document everything while she still thinks she's getting away with it. Our first step was contacting Detective Michael Torres with the Cedar Falls Police Department, who specialized in financial crimes. When I called the non-emergency line and explained that I needed to report identity theft and fraud involving veteran benefits, the dispatcher immediately transferred me to Detective Torres's voicemail. His return call came within 2 hours, which suggested that cases involving veteran benefits received priority attention. Detective Torres was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of careful professionalism that indicated he took financial crimes seriously. When Jessica and I met with him Monday morning, he spent over an hour reviewing the VA evidence package and asking detailed questions about Dorothy's access to my personal information.
"This is definitely criminal fraud," he confirmed after examining the forged signatures and bank statements. "The question is whether we can build a strong enough case to ensure prosecution. Federal agencies like the VA have their own investigators, but local cases involving identity theft often get better results through county prosecutors who understand the community impact." Detective Torres explained that our next steps would involve documenting Dorothy's lifestyle changes, gathering evidence of her travel expenses, and establishing a timeline that connected her sudden spending increases to the dates of fraudulent benefit usage. "We need to show a pattern of behavior that correlates with the stolen money," he said. "The more evidence we can gather before she realizes she's under investigation, the stronger our case will be." This investigative phase proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Following Dorothy's activities without alerting her to our suspicions required a level of deception that felt uncomfortable, even though it was necessary for justice. Jessica and I developed a system where she would visit Dorothy regularly under the pretense of checking on her mother's emotional well-being, while I would document every interaction I had with Dorothy, recording dates, times, and specific conversations. Jessica's first reconnaissance visit yielded disturbing results. Dorothy's duplex, which had always been modestly furnished with secondhand furniture and practical decorations, now displayed clear signs of recent spending. A new flat-screen television dominated the living room, replacing the ancient CRT model that had been there for over a decade. The kitchen had been updated with new appliances, not top-of-the-line models, but certainly significant upgrades from her previous outdated equipment. She also had cruise brochures spread all over the kitchen table, Jessica reported after that first visit. Not just brochures, actual booking confirmations and travel itineraries. She's planning a 2-week Mediterranean cruise for September, and when I asked how she could afford something like that on her retirement income, she said she'd been saving for years and decided life was too short to not enjoy herself. The Mediterranean cruise represented an expense that would have been impossible on Dorothy's legitimate income. Her Social Security payments and small pension from the dental office totaled less than $1,800 per month, barely enough to cover her basic living expenses in Waterloo. A 2-week Mediterranean cruise would cost at least $4,000, not including airfare, shore excursions, and travel expenses. Detective Torres was particularly interested in Dorothy's cruise plans because they represented clear evidence of lifestyle inflation that coincided with the benefit fraud timeline. He explained that criminals often make the mistake of spending stolen money on luxury items that are obviously beyond their legitimate means. Travel expenses are especially useful evidence because they're well documented and easy to trace. Meanwhile, I continued documenting Dorothy's visits to my apartment, paying attention to details I had previously overlooked. During her Tuesday visit, she spent an unusual amount of time in my home office, claiming she was dusting, but actually examining papers on my desk with more attention than cleaning required. When I joined her in the office, she was holding my latest VA benefit statement, reading it with the kind of focus that suggested she was looking for specific information. "I just want to make sure everything looks correct," she explained when I asked why she was reading my financial documents. "Sometimes these government agencies make mistakes, and it's important to catch them early." Her explanation was plausible enough to avoid direct confrontation, but her behavior clearly indicated ongoing surveillance of my financial situation. The most difficult aspect of this investigative phase was maintaining normal family relationships while knowing what Dorothy had done. Every conversation felt like a performance where I had to hide my knowledge of her crimes while gathering additional evidence. When she asked about my weekend plans, I wondered if she was trying to determine when my apartment would be empty. When she offered advice about managing my finances, I had to resist the urge to confront her about stealing those same finances. Jessica struggled with similar challenges during her visits to Dorothy. "It's like looking at a stranger wearing my mother's face," she told me after spending an afternoon with Dorothy. "Everything she says sounds normal on the surface, but knowing what she's really doing makes every conversation feel like a lie." The emotional toll of maintaining these deceptive relationships was exhausting for both of us, but Detective Torres emphasized that any premature confrontation could jeopardize the criminal case. 3 weeks into our investigative phase, we discovered that Dorothy's crimes extended beyond just financial education fraud. Jessica found bank statements in Dorothy's kitchen that showed she had also attempted to access Marcus's life insurance payments by claiming to be the primary beneficiary. The insurance company had rejected these claims because I was clearly listed as the sole beneficiary, but the attempts revealed the scope of Dorothy's willingness to exploit Marcus's death for financial gain. "She tried to steal everything," Jessica said, after photographing the insurance correspondence with her phone. "Not just the VA benefits, the life insurance, probably anything else she thought she could access. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud. This was a systematic attempt to claim everything Marcus left behind." As we prepared for the next phase of our investigation, I realized that we were no longer just gathering evidence of financial crimes. We were documenting the complete destruction of a family relationship, the betrayal of trust during the most vulnerable period of my life, and the exploitation of a son's death by his own mother. The case we were building would seek justice not just for stolen money, but for the violation of everything that should have been sacred about grief, family, and love.
4 weeks into our investigation, Detective Torres called with news that would test every ounce of resolve Jessica and I had built up. The VA's internal fraud investigation had uncovered additional criminal activity that extended far beyond Dorothy's theft of my benefits. She had been running a sophisticated identity theft operation that targeted multiple military widows across 3 counties, using information obtained through her volunteer work at the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. "Your mother-in-law isn't just a grieving woman who made some bad financial decisions," Detective Torres explained during an emergency meeting at the police station. "She's been systematically targeting military families for over 2 years, using her position as a VFW volunteer to access personal information about deceased veterans and their survivors. The scope of Dorothy's crimes was staggering. At least 12 other families had been victimized, with total losses exceeding $45,000. This revelation transformed our personal family crisis into something much larger and more serious. I was no longer just seeking justice for myself. I was potentially the key witness in a case that could protect other military families from similar exploitation. The weight of this responsibility felt overwhelming, especially when Detective Torres explained that Dorothy's other victims had been too intimidated or embarrassed to come forward. Most of these families are dealing with fresh grief and financial stress, he continued. When someone in a position of trust steals from them, they often blame themselves or worry that reporting the crime will make their situation worse. You and Jessica might be the only witnesses willing to testify against her. The idea that other families had suffered in silence while Dorothy continued her crimes made my anger burn even hotter. Jessica took this news particularly hard, struggling with the realization that her mother wasn't just a grieving woman who had made a desperate mistake, but a calculated predator who had been targeting vulnerable families for years. "How many people did she hurt while I was defending her?" Jessica asked after we left the police station. "How many widows and children suffered because I didn't want to believe my mother was capable of something like this?" The expanded investigation required us to maintain our surveillance activities for several more weeks while federal agencies coordinated with local law enforcement. The FBI had become involved due to the multi-jurisdictional nature of Dorothy's crimes and the federal benefits involved. Special Agent Rebecca Walsh from the FBI's Des Moines field office became our primary contact. And her approach was significantly more intense than Detective Torres's methodical local investigation. Agent Walsh was probably in her 40s, with graying blonde hair, and the kind of sharp intelligence that made every conversation feel like an interrogation, even when she was on our side. During our first meeting, she explained that Dorothy's case was part of a larger pattern of veteran benefit fraud that the FBI had been tracking across the Midwest. Criminals like your mother-in-law often start small, targeting one or two families they have personal connections to. But the ease of stealing federal benefits and the lack of immediate detection encourages them to expand their operations. What began as opportunistic theft has evolved into organized fraud that threatens the integrity of programs designed to help our most vulnerable veterans' families. The federal investigation revealed techniques Dorothy had used that were far more sophisticated than Jessica and I had imagined. She had created multiple fake identities using combinations of real social security numbers and fabricated personal information. She maintained post office boxes in 3 different cities to receive fraudulent benefit payments. Most disturbingly, she had cultivated relationships with grieving families specifically to gain access to their personal information and financial vulnerabilities. Agent Walsh showed us surveillance photos taken outside the VFW post where Dorothy volunteered, documenting her interactions with recently widowed military spouses who were seeking help navigating benefit applications. She would approach these women during their most vulnerable moments, offering to help them understand the complex benefit system while actually gathering information she could use to defraud them later. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a young mother named Sandra Mills, whose Army husband had been killed in a training accident 6 months earlier. Dorothy had befriended Sandra at a VFW support group, offering to help her apply for survivor benefits. Instead, Dorothy had used Sandra's personal information to open fraudulent accounts and steal over $6,000 in educational benefits intended for Sandra's 2 young children. Sandra never reported the theft because Dorothy convinced her that the missing benefits were due to government processing errors. Dorothy would tell these women that bureaucratic mistakes were common and that they should be patient while she helped resolve the issues. Meanwhile, she was stealing money that these families desperately needed to rebuild their lives.
Learning about Dorothy's other victims forced me to confront the possibility that everything about her relationship with Marcus and our family had been calculated manipulation. Had she viewed Marcus's military service as a future opportunity for exploitation? Had her expressions of pride in his service been genuine, or had she been mentally cataloging the benefits she might someday be able to access? These questions became even more disturbing when Agent Walsh revealed that Dorothy had been researching military benefits and fraud techniques online for over 3 years, dating back to before Marcus's death. Computer forensics experts had recovered her internet search history, which included queries about veteran survivor benefits, identity theft techniques, and methods for forging government documents. "She didn't stumble into this type of crime after your husband died," Agent Walsh explained bluntly. "She had been planning and preparing for this kind of fraud for years. Your husband's death simply provided her with the first opportunity to put her research into practice." The premeditated nature of Dorothy's crimes shattered my last hopes that her actions might have been driven by grief or desperation rather than cold calculation. Meanwhile, Dorothy's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic as she apparently sensed that something had changed in our family dynamics. She began showing up at my apartment at odd hours, claiming she was worried about my emotional state, but clearly fishing for information about my activities and communications. Her questions became more pointed and suspicious, particularly about any correspondence I might have received from government agencies. During one particularly tense visit, Dorothy spent 20 minutes explaining why I should consider moving closer to her in Waterloo, ostensibly so she could provide better support during my grief recovery. "You're too isolated here," she argued, gesturing around the apartment Marcus and I had shared. "A young woman shouldn't be living alone with all these memories. You need fresh surroundings and family nearby to help you heal." Her suggestion that I relocate felt like an attempt to gain greater control over my living situation and potentially my mail delivery. When I politely declined, explaining that I wasn't ready to leave the home Marcus and I had built together, Dorothy's expression shifted to something that looked almost like frustration before she caught herself and resumed her concerned mother-in-law persona. "I just worry about you being taken advantage of," she said, and the irony of this statement from someone who had been systematically robbing me was almost overwhelming. "There are people out there who prey on vulnerable widows, and you're still too trusting for your own good." Her warning about predators targeting grieving widows was particularly galling, coming from someone who was doing exactly that to multiple families. Jessica's surveillance visits during this period revealed that Dorothy was also becoming increasingly paranoid about her own security. She had installed new locks on her duplex, started parking her car in the garage instead of the driveway, and seemed to be screening her phone calls more carefully. When Jessica asked about these changes, Dorothy claimed she was concerned about crime in the neighborhood, but her behavior suggested someone who was preparing for potential law enforcement attention. The most challenging aspect of this extended investigation was maintaining my normal routines while knowing that federal agents were building a case that would eventually destroy what remained of our family relationships. I continued teaching my third-grade class, attending parent conferences, and managing the daily responsibilities of my life, but everything felt like it was happening to someone else. The emotional energy required to perform normalcy while participating in a criminal investigation was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. My students occasionally asked why I seemed distracted or sad, and I struggled to explain my emotional state without revealing the ongoing investigation. "Sometimes adults have complicated problems that take time to solve," I would tell them, which was perhaps the most honest thing I could say while maintaining the secrecy that Agent Walsh had insisted was crucial to the case's success. The waiting became the hardest part. Each day brought new evidence of Dorothy's crimes and additional victims who had suffered because of her exploitation, but we still couldn't take action without jeopardizing the broader investigation. Agent Walsh repeatedly emphasized that patience was essential to ensure that all of Dorothy's criminal activities were documented and that other co-conspirators, if any existed, could be identified. "We only get one chance to build this case correctly," she reminded me during one of our weekly briefings.
If we move too quickly, or if Dorothy realizes she's under investigation, she could destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or flee before we can arrest her. The other families she's victimized deserve justice too, and that requires us to be thorough and strategic. As we approached the end of this surveillance phase, I realized that the investigation had changed me in fundamental ways. I was no longer the trusting, somewhat naive young widow who had relied on Dorothy's support during the darkest period of my life. The betrayal had forced me to develop skills and instincts I never thought I would need. The ability to detect deception, to maintain emotional walls with people I had once trusted, and to prioritize justice over family harmony. But this transformation came with costs that extended beyond my relationship with Dorothy. I found myself questioning every kindness, analyzing every offer of help for potential ulterior motives, and struggling to trust anyone's expressions of concern or support. The woman who had once believed that people were fundamentally good was learning to see the world through the lens of someone who had been systematically deceived by someone she loved.
Everything unraveled on a human Thursday morning in July when Dorothy made a mistake that would expose her crimes and force the confrontation we had been carefully avoiding. I was preparing breakfast before school when my phone rang with a call from my bank's fraud prevention department. The representative, a woman named Linda Chen, informed me that someone had attempted to wire transfer $8,000 from my checking account to an overseas account in the Cayman Islands. The transfer was flagged by our automated systems because it originated from an IP address that doesn't match your usual banking patterns, Linda explained. We've frozen the transaction pending your verification, but we need you to come in immediately to review the attempted transfer and confirm whether you authorized it. The amount was exactly the sum that Dorothy had stolen through the fraudulent educational benefits, and the timing suggested she was trying to move the money offshore before her crimes were discovered. My hands shook as I called Detective Torres, who immediately contacted Agent Walsh. Within an hour, both law enforcement officers were at my apartment, examining my computer and questioning me about my recent interactions with Dorothy. The IP address trace had revealed that the wire transfer attempt originated from the public library in Waterloo, just 3 blocks from Dorothy's duplex, during a time when security cameras would have recorded everyone who used the computers. "This changes everything," Agent Walsh said grimly as she coordinated with her technical team via phone. "Your mother-in-law is preparing to flee, which means she either suspects our investigation or she's reached some kind of deadline that's forcing her to liquidate stolen assets. Either way, we can't wait for more evidence. We need to arrest her today before she disappears." The decision to accelerate the timeline created a cascade of urgent preparations that transformed my quiet morning into the epicenter of a federal law enforcement operation. Agent Walsh contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office to expedite arrest warrants, while Detective Torres coordinated with the Cedar Falls police to ensure Dorothy couldn't escape through local jurisdictions. Jessica was summoned from Minneapolis with instructions to maintain normal contact with Dorothy to prevent her from becoming suspicious. As federal agents prepared for Dorothy's arrest, I faced the terrifying realization that our months of careful investigation were about to explode into public view. The woman who had comforted me at Marcus's funeral, who had held my hand during those first devastating weeks of widowhood, who had been a surrogate and leather figure during the darkest period of my life, was about to be arrested as a federal criminal. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Agent Walsh explained that Dorothy would likely be charged with multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and theft of government benefits. With the evidence we've gathered and the number of victims involved, she's looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison, Walsh said. These aren't state charges that might result in probation or community service. These are serious federal felonies with mandatory minimum sentences. The magnitude of Dorothy's potential punishment forced me to confront whether I was prepared for the consequences of my decision to pursue justice. 20 years in prison would likely be a life sentence for a 63-year-old woman. Dorothy would probably die behind bars, never again walking freely in the world that Marcus had grown up in. The weight of this responsibility felt crushing, even though I knew Dorothy had brought these consequences on herself through her systematic exploitation of grieving families. Jessica arrived from Minneapolis just as the arrest operation was beginning, and her emotional state was even more fragile than mine. She had spent the drive from Minnesota agonizing over the destruction of her family and her role in enabling Dorothy's crimes through years of willful blindness to her mother's manipulative behavior. "I should have seen this coming," she said repeatedly as we waited for news from the arrest team. The signature forgery after Dad died, the way she always found ways to access other people's money, the questions she asked about everyone's financial situation, there were signs for years that I ignored because I didn't want to believe my mother was capable of something like this. Her guilt was palpable and heartbreaking, but I tried to reassure her that Dorothy's ability to deceive extended far beyond family blindness. She fooled VFW volunteers, bank employees, government officials, and multiple grief-stricken families. This wasn't amateur hour fraud that we should have easily detected. She was sophisticated, careful, and practiced at exploiting people's trust and vulnerability. At 2:15 p.m., Agent Walsh called to confirm that Dorothy had been arrested without incident at her duplex. She had been in the middle of packing suitcases when federal agents executed their search warrant, suggesting she was indeed planning to flee. The search of her home had yielded boxes of fraudulent documents, multiple fake ID cards, and detailed notes about her victim's personal information and financial vulnerabilities.
She had files on at least 20 different military families, Agent Walsh reported. Some were active fraud victims, others appeared to be potential future targets. She was running this operation like a business, with detailed records of everyone's benefit amounts, payment schedules, and personal weaknesses she could exploit. The systematic nature of Dorothy's crimes was even more extensive than the FBI had initially suspected. The discovery that Dorothy had been researching my personal life as a potential fraud target even before Marcus's death was perhaps the most devastating revelation of all. Among her papers, agents found a file labeled with my maiden name that contained information about my teaching salary, my family background, and notes about my trusting personality and lack of financial sophistication. She had been profiling me as a potential victim while pretending to welcome me into her family. "She saw your marriage to her son as an opportunity," Agent Walsh explained during our debriefing. "The file suggests she was already planning to exploit Marcus's military benefits in the event of his death. Your husband's tragic accident simply accelerated a criminal plan that was already in development." This revelation meant that Dorothy's expressions of love for Marcus and acceptance of our marriage had been tainted by calculations about future criminal opportunities. The media attention began almost immediately after Dorothy's arrest. The story of a military widow discovering that her mother-in-law had been stealing veteran benefits captured regional and eventually national attention. Local news crews positioned themselves outside my apartment and my school, forcing me to take emergency leave to avoid the constant barrage of interview requests and invasive questions about my family relationships. The headlines were sensational and painful. "Grieving widow discovers mother-in-law's veteran benefit fraud," "VFW volunteer accused of targeting military families," and "federal fraud ring exploited war widows." Seeing my personal tragedy reduced to clickbait headlines felt like another violation, though I understood that media attention might help other victims come forward or prevent future crimes. The most challenging aspect of Dorothy's arrest was dealing with the reactions of people who had known our family before the fraud was exposed. Some expressed shock and sympathy, unable to believe that Dorothy could have committed such calculated crimes. Others seemed to blame me for destroying the family by pursuing criminal charges instead of handling the matter privately. A few even suggested that I was overreacting to what they characterized as a family financial dispute rather than systematic federal fraud. "You really think sending an old woman to prison is going to bring Marcus back?" one particularly cruel comment from a former family friend asked. These responses revealed how little some people understood of the scope of Dorothy's crimes or the impact on multiple families beyond just mine. The suggestion that seeking justice for systematic fraud was somehow disrespectful to Marcus's memory was especially painful. Jessica struggled even more intensely with the public nature of our family's destruction. As Dorothy's daughter, she faced questions about whether she had been involved in the fraud or had knowledge of her mother's crimes. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing by the FBI investigation, Jessica felt the stigma of being related to someone who had become a symbol of betrayal and exploitation within the military community. "I'll never be able to introduce myself as Dorothy Carter's daughter again," Jessica said during one particularly difficult conversation. "She didn't just steal money, she stole our family name, our reputation, and our ability to honor Dad's memory without people thinking about her crimes." The generational impact of Dorothy's actions extended far beyond the immediate victims, to include her own children's future relationships and social connections. 3 days after Dorothy's arrest, I received a call from Sandra Mills, the young mother whose children's educational benefits Dorothy had stolen. Sandra had seen the news coverage and wanted to thank me for having the courage to report Dorothy's crimes and pursue justice through the criminal system. "I thought I was going crazy when my children's benefits disappeared," Sandra told me through tears. "Dorothy convinced me it was bureaucratic errors and that she was helping me resolve them. I've been struggling financially for months thinking the government had made mistakes with my applications. Finding out that someone deliberately stole from my children's future, it's almost worse than losing my husband all over again." Sandra's call reminded me why I had made the difficult decision to pursue criminal charges despite the personal cost. Dorothy's crimes weren't abstract financial violations. They were attacks on families during their most vulnerable moments. Theft of resources meant to help children whose fathers had died serving their country. The pain in Sandra's voice reinforced my conviction that exposing Dorothy's crimes was not just about my own justice, but about protecting other families from similar exploitation. As I prepared for the next phase of the legal process, grand jury testimony, eventual trial proceedings, and civil recovery efforts, I realized that this crisis had fundamentally changed not just my relationship with Dorothy, but my understanding of justice, family, and my own capacity for difficult decisions. The woman who had once prioritized family harmony over personal comfort had learned to prioritize truth and justice over family relationships, even when the cost was devastating.
18 months after Dorothy's arrest, I stood in the federal courthouse in Cedar Rapids, watching her receive a sentence of 16 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Morrison, had listened to victim impact statements from 7 military families, including my own, before delivering a sentence that reflected both the scope of Dorothy's crimes and the particular cruelty of targeting grieving families during their most vulnerable moments. "Mrs. Carter, you violated the sacred trust that military families place in their communities," Judge Morrison said, as Dorothy stood before the bench in her orange jumpsuit. "You exploited grief, manipulated loss, and stole resources meant to honor the sacrifices of our fallen service members. Your crimes represent not just theft, but a fundamental betrayal of the values that these families fought and died to protect." Dorothy had aged dramatically during her time in federal custody, awaiting trial. The woman who had once projected confidence and maternal authority now appeared frail and diminished, her gray hair unkempt and her shoulders permanently hunched in defeat. She had initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining her innocence through months of pretrial hearings, but the overwhelming evidence eventually forced her to accept a plea agreement that included full restitution to all victims. The trial had revealed the full scope of Dorothy's criminal enterprise, which extended far beyond the 12 families initially identified by the FBI. Investigators ultimately documented fraud affecting 23 military families across 4 states, with total losses exceeding $78,000. Dorothy had been operating her scheme for nearly 4 years, beginning with small-scale identity theft and gradually expanding into sophisticated multi-state fraud involving forged documents, fake bank accounts, and elaborate deception strategies. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that Dorothy had specifically targeted families with young children, believing that these victims would be less likely to pursue criminal charges out of fear of further disrupting their children's lives. Her victim files contained detailed psychological profiles describing each family's emotional vulnerabilities and financial pressures,
information she used to calibrate her approach to maximize both theft potential and victim compliance. She wasn't just stealing money, testified Dr. Rachel Martinez, a forensic psychologist who had analyzed Dorothy's methods for the prosecution. She was systematically exploiting trauma, using her victims' grief as a weapon against them. This level of emotional manipulation represents a form of psychological abuse that extends far beyond financial crime. The restitution process had been complex and emotionally draining, requiring each victim family to document their losses and testify about the impact of Dorothy's crimes on their recovery from loss. For many families, including mine, the financial damage was only part of the harm caused by Dorothy's betrayal. The violation of trust during our most vulnerable period had lasting effects on our ability to accept help, form relationships, and maintain faith in community support systems. Sandra Mills, the young mother whose children's educational benefits Dorothy had stolen, had become an unexpected ally and friend during the legal process. Her strength in confronting Dorothy's crimes had inspired other victims to come forward, and her testimony about the impact on her children's future educational opportunities had been particularly powerful during sentencing proceedings. My kids will never understand why someone would steal from them after their daddy died protecting our country, Sandra had told the judge during her victim impact statement. But they will understand that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's scary and hard. That's what their father taught me, and that's what I'm teaching them. The financial recovery had been better than expected, thanks to asset forfeiture laws that allowed federal prosecutors to seize Dorothy's fraudulently purchased possessions and bank account contents. Her new car, upgraded appliances, and cruise payments were all recovered and liquidated to fund victim restitution. The process had taken over a year to complete, but ultimately, most victims recovered approximately 80% of their documented losses. For me personally, the restitution covered not just the $8,000 in stolen benefits, but also legal costs, counseling expenses, and compensation for the emotional distress caused by Dorothy's systematic deception. While no amount of money could repair the broken trust or undo the psychological damage of being betrayed during grief, the financial recovery allowed me to regain stability and begin planning for a future I had temporarily lost sight of during the crisis. Jessica had struggled more than anyone with the aftermath of Dorothy's crimes and imprisonment. As Dorothy's daughter, she faced ongoing questions about her knowledge of the fraud and her decision to testify against her own mother. The FBI investigation had completely cleared Jessica of any involvement, but the social stigma of being related to such a notorious criminal had forced her to relocate from Minneapolis to Denver, where she could start over with colleagues who didn't know her family history.
I lost both my parents in different ways, Jessica told me during one of our monthly phone calls. Dad died in an accident, but Mom died through her own choices. At least Dad's death made sense in the context of a life well lived. Mom's crimes made it impossible to remember anything good about our family without also thinking about the people she hurt. The relationship between Jessica and me had ultimately grown stronger through our shared experience of Dorothy's betrayal, but it required careful navigation around the complex emotions of family loyalty, justice, and forgiveness. Jessica supported my decision to pursue criminal charges while simultaneously grieving the loss of the mother she thought she had known. This delicate balance required ongoing communication and mutual respect for each other's different positions in relation to Dorothy's crimes. The broader impact of Dorothy's case extended beyond our immediate family situation. The VFW post where Dorothy had volunteered implemented new background check procedures and privacy protocols to prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable military families. The VA enhanced its fraud detection systems and created additional safeguards for educational benefit transfers. Several state Veterans Affairs departments cited Dorothy's case when advocating for stronger penalties for crimes targeting military families.
Most importantly, Dorothy's prosecution encouraged other victims of benefit fraud to come forward, leading to additional arrests and investigations across multiple states. Agent Walsh contacted me 6 months after Dorothy's sentencing to report that the case had generated dozens of tips about similar fraud schemes, resulting in several other arrests and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen benefits. Your willingness to pursue this case when you could have quietly recovered your own losses probably saved dozens of other families from similar exploitation, Agent Walsh told me. Criminals like Dorothy count on their victims being too ashamed or overwhelmed to seek justice. When someone like you fights back publicly, it breaks that cycle of silence. On a personal level, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of family, trust, and resilience. The naive young woman who had relied on Dorothy's support during early widowhood had been replaced by someone more cautious, but also more confident in her own judgment and capabilities. I had learned to navigate complex legal systems, work with federal investigators, and make difficult decisions under pressure, skills I never expected to need, but that had proven invaluable. The process also taught me that justice and healing aren't always synonymous. Dorothy's imprisonment provided a sense of legal resolution and protected other families from future victimization, but it didn't restore my ability to trust easily or erase the psychological impact of being systematically deceived during grief. Those wounds required different kinds of healing that involved therapy, time, and gradual rebuilding of faith in human relationships. 2 years after Dorothy's sentencing, I made the decision to leave Cedar Falls and relocate to Colorado, where Jessica had established her new life. The apartment that Marcus and I had shared, while filled with happy memories, had also become the site of Dorothy's manipulation and surveillance. Moving felt like closing one chapter of my life and beginning another, freed from the geographical reminders of both loss and betrayal. My new job teaching 4th grade in a Denver suburb provided fresh challenges and opportunities that weren't shadowed by my past experiences. My students knew me as Miss Carter, a teacher who had moved from Iowa, rather than as the widow whose mother-in-law had become a federal criminal. This anonymity allowed me to rebuild my professional identity around my skills and interests rather than my personal tragedy. The veteran benefits that Dorothy had tried to steal became the foundation for a new chapter of my life that honored Marcus's memory in ways Dorothy never could have imagined. I used the educational benefits to earn a master's degree in counseling, specializing in trauma recovery and family crisis intervention. The program gave me tools to understand my own healing process while preparing me to help other people navigate similar challenges. Today, I work part-time as a school counselor and part-time as a consultant for the VA, helping develop programs to support military families and identify potential fraud targeting vulnerable survivors. The work is emotionally demanding but deeply meaningful, allowing me to transform my painful experience into protection and support for others facing similar challenges. Marcus would have been proud of the person I became through this ordeal. Stronger, wiser, and more committed to justice than the young woman he married. While I would give anything to have him back and to have never experienced Dorothy's betrayal, I've learned that sometimes the worst experiences in our lives can become the foundation for our most important contributions to others. The woman who once trusted blindly learned to trust wisely. The widow who once relied on others for protection learned to protect herself and others. And the victim who could have remained silent found her voice and used it to prevent other families from suffering the same exploitation. That's not the ending I would have chosen, but it's the ending I built from the choices I made when everything fell apart. And in building it, I discovered that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's cruelty define the rest of your story.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.